now it gives me pleasure to introduce Mr. Bob Bax.
Thank you, Dick.
Sorry I called it a camp.
Huh?
Sorry I called it a slave labor camp.
Yes, I'll explain Dick's excuse in a little while. Obviously, those notes were written 2 years ago. We were married 67 years.
Wonderful. Tell Linda to update it.
And as Dick said, yes, I was an American soldier in World War II. You'll recall that on December 11, 1941, 4 days after the Japanese struck Pearl Harbor, Adolf Hitler declared war on the U.S. So here we were, an isolationist nation, really, now suddenly engaged in really amounted to 2 wars. I was in school. I was a sophomore at Ohio University at the time. Many of our evenings at the fraternity were spent discussing the war. And we used to discuss other things that young college students would discuss normally. But the war was occupying our minds and perhaps our instincts too. And often these bull sessions turned into the war. And as we discussed it more and more, subliminally, each of us seemed to be suggesting to the others that perhaps all of us, we really didn't belong on a college campus any longer. Our nation was at war. It would obviously be a very difficult war, and our place was really in the military. So I volunteered and went to Fort Dix, went to several bases for training, basic training, and then combat training afterward. Then shipped off to Fort Meade, Maryland, where I got onto a very beautiful and large British luxury liner. It was the SS Mauritania. It had been a beautiful white while it was serving the public, and then at this stage now it was turned gray to make it less visible, obviously, to the enemy and his submarines all across the Atlantic. We did cross the Atlantic, landed in Liverpool, a little more training, and then crossed the English Channel, and I landed on Omaha Beach. It wasn't more than 2 or 3 days later that I was engaged in combat. I was assigned to the 6th Armored Infantry Unit, part of General George Patton's 3rd Army. We moved rapidly across France, and then came December 16, 1944, and the first wave of the German onslaught, which was overwhelming. The unit that I had trained with for combat in the States, the 106th Infantry Division, and I'm sure some of you know this from history that you've read, the 106th Infantry Division lost 75% of its troops on that first day alone when the Germans struck. Many said that the unit was green, it wasn't quite ready for combat yet. But nevertheless, we took a heavy loss of life at that time. At the end of the first day, I was reported missing in action, so the notice that went from the War Department to my parents said that I was missing in action. Several months went by, and the assumption that I learned later, the assumption of my parents was that how long could I be missing? And they assumed that I was dead. Actually, I was not missing in action. I had been on the line, so to speak, been battling for several days. and I was ordered to go behind the lines for some rest, some food. On the way back, I heard a call for volunteers. I don't know what instinct drove me to immediately volunteer. I had been told earlier, one of the things you never do in the Army is to volunteer. Very common. And here I was, just instinctively moved toward doing just what I was told not to do. Apparently what had happened during that initial attack was that somewhere along the line, our radio contact was broken. It meant that commanders could not develop their battle strategies without knowing where the lines are, and they had been moved around substantially. So somebody had to go out and find out where are the Allied lines, and then report back. So I volunteered. I saw a Jeep in the distance. I said, I will come, and I did. I commandeered that Jeep. I signaled to 5 others to join me. And they did. They hopped into the back of the Jeep. We took off down the road. Now, our objective, of course, was to find American, British troops. Instead, as we rounded a curve in the road, a sight that I remember so vividly today, not more than 15 yards in front of us, I saw a German 88 millimeter cannon mounted on a tank, pointed right at us. I jammed the brakes on, we skidded off the road. If anybody had pulled the trigger, of course, we'd be gone. We needed, and then all of a sudden, small arms fire from our right begins to pour in, rifle, machine gun fire. Where it's coming from what kind of troops, we did not know. We needed shelter someplace, somewhere we could defend ourselves. The Jeep was incapacitated, couldn't drive it any further. I saw a shack across the road and decided we will head for that shack and perhaps we can defend ourselves from there. One of the men had the vision to detach the machine gun from the Jeep. We took that across with us. He mounted it in a window, which was a bay window, big bay window, offered very little protection, but we had to have an outlet for that machine gun to fire. Within not more than maybe a couple of minutes, he was hit and killed. Under battle-ready conditions, very often you do things simply by instinct. And the instinct that drove me to get in front of that machine gun is one that I still don't quite understand today. But that was the thing to do. Somebody had to fire that machine gun. All we had other than that was some rifles. And from the heavy fire coming across at us, the rifles would not be enough. So I did get in front of the machine gun, and I fired at everything I saw move. I hit many Germans, killed some. That went on through the day. It started really late morning and then carried through late afternoon, along about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, somewhere around that time. We ran out of ammunition. Now, what do? We had no idea what the enemy was across the road, but we knew we had to protect ourselves and somehow. And I glanced at the floor of this shack, and I see a cover which suggests that there's a cellar beneath the floor. And I figured what we will do will be to try to hide out there until darkness, and then come out and infiltrate through the German lines and get back to Allied forces. It didn't turn out that way. Sometime after we descended, I have no idea how long we were there was a tapping on that door. I pushed it open, and again, it's a sight that I remember vividly. To digress for just a moment, I never talked about the war for 53 years, like so many, many veterans, and I'm sure some of you can attest to that. Like many, many veterans, didn't really want to talk about it. But I had spent a weekend, my wife and I had spent a weekend with Elie Wiesel. I think you all know who Elie Wiesel is. And the combination of that of conversation and spending the weekend alone in a guest house, a president's guest house of our university, that impressed me enough. And then the questions of my then 7 and 9-year-old grandchildren, they raised a lot of questions. One day they were sitting in our den, and they said, "Poppy, were you in the war?" I said, "Yeah." "Where did you sleep? What did you eat? Did you have a rifle, a gun? Did you ever fire it? Did you ever kill anybody?" And something just turned in my head and said, "I've got to start talking. Got to start talking about it now." And I did. I met up with the Holocaust Council of Metro West, New Jersey, and I started talking to young people. It became a mission of mine to do. But here I was now, and late in the day, the Germans overran the shack. And the tapping on the door, and I pull it open and I see these guns. They pulled us all up from the cellar. There were 3 able-bodied and 3 who were injured. The able-bodied were able to take care of, get the wounded up. And they took the Germans took the others away. And for some reason, the sergeant who was heading that group singled me out and put his rifle barrel to my back and had me show him around the shack to make sure there were no booby traps in it, and then shoved me out of that shack and across the road. As we got across the road, shells, they were either British or American shells, started to come in. Now this was the third of the campaigns that I had fought through. It was the Ardennes campaign because it was fought in the Ardennes forest. So when these shells came in, there were tree blasts, and I'm sure some of you recognize what I mean by tree blast, heavy metal, hot metal rather, coming down around you. Now when that attack began, the German sergeant jumped into his bunker, and I realized one of the reasons it was so hard to hit and overcome them, if we thought we might have been able to do so, was that they were well protected in these bunkers. So the German sergeant was down there. I tried to come down, and he said, "Nine, would not let me." So I was really a target of our own artillery. There were very, very difficult moments because at any time, any of those pieces of shrapnel could pierce my skin and I could be dead very, very easily. The German sergeant looks up at me and says, "Why are you Americans here?" And all of a sudden I realize, my gosh, the good fortune I have. I come across a German soldier who speaks English. And so he said, "This is not your war." I said, "You made it our war, of course." I then say, "What are you going to do with me?" And he says, "I have to kill you." I assumed that to be his next action because the order had been issued by high command. At that stage in the campaign, there were no more Allied prisoners to be taken alive. My first instinct, of course, was to run. I had run track in high school, and what a place now to use all that competition and skill that I had developed. But I looked down the road. There was only one place to go, and that was the road that we crossed when they moved us over to their bunkers. I looked down the road, and all I saw was bunker after bunker, and on each one, 2 silhouettes. One was a machine gun, and the other was a German helmet. And I realized I never even would get out of the starting block there. And behind me and all around me were other bunkers, other Germans. So there was no place to run at all. The only thing I had left was conversation. And my good fortune again was that this German spoke English. And we started to discuss the war and the way it was going. At one point, he reaches down, and I figure he's a non-commissioned officer. He probably has a pistol in addition to his rifle. Well, he reached down, I figured him pull out the pistol, and he said, because he had just said to me, "For you, the war is over." And I figured he was going to fire. No, he then goes on to say that I'm going to send you back to a prisoner of war camp. And he knew that I knew that going to a prisoner of war camp would save my life, would keep me from combat, and I could sit out the war there. Why did he do this? As it turned out, he not only spoke English, but he also was an honorable man who really applauded gallantry, even though that gallantry was from the enemy. So here, mortal enemies assigned to kill one another suddenly become almost comrades. If you were to hear the conversation, you would see changes going on in the tone of our voice and so forth. So I have no doubt whatsoever that that was his intention, to save my life by sending me to a prisoner of war camp. That was not to be, apparently, because when he did call 2 guards over to take me away, somewhere along the way, they were stopped, and a German officer countermanded the sergeant's order. So instead of going to prisoner of war camp, I was thrown in with a mass of other soldiers. Some were American, some were British, and some were from the Soviet Union. You remember in 1941, Hitler opened the second front, and he was battling the military of the Soviet Union. And so many of those Soviets were captured. So here I was with a bunch of Soviet military and American and some British. I was told, lie down. Most of the signals that I got from them were not even in language. It was just with the point of that rifle, the barrel of that rifle. They did everything down. So I had to lie down. Shortly after that, we were all again up. Now they took my winter coat and they took my gloves. As I learned later, the temperature during that period in which I was a captive of the German army, during that period, the temperatures in Germany ranged between 0 and 5 degrees centigrade. It was very, very cold. We were motioned to get up and we started to march. Darkness came. And then those rifle barrels get pointed down. Down where? Off to the side of the road. But on the road, we were ordered to lie down. The road was covered with snow and ice. For the next 82 out of 90 nights, that's where I slept. Supposed to have slept. 82 out of 90 nights on snow and ice. Sleep was almost impossible. Again, I had no overcoat, just a thin jacket, and I had no gloves. I had to remain awake all night. I didn't have much choice. It was so uncomfortable with that cold coming through my back or the sides, wherever I was lying. So I was awake most of the time. And what could I do? I thought about it. My mind was going, and I was thinking about what? I started to think about food. It seems, if you just look at it nakedly, that's highly unlikely. Why would you want to think about food when you are starving? And the reality was that that's what did happen. From that day on, we were starved constantly. And I thought of those foods, and I would tell you that they seemed very, very real. the emotions I discovered were as part of that discomfort in captivity as the physical pain. But I relieved the emotions at least by thinking, someday I will get through, I'll get out of here. Either the war will be over or I will escape. Months later, when I got back to the States, and I was hospitalized, I lay awake many nights. I was hospitalized for 10 months, 1 month overseas, and then 9 months here at Halloran General Hospital on Staten Island. And during many of those sleepless nights, I did think about incidents that occurred during the war. They weren't nightmares, but I kept thinking about them. And I kept thinking, too, during that period, I also remembered that it was food that emotionally kept me going during that period. I asked a nurse for a little pad or a booklet or something that I could write on. And she came up with this little brown, I call my little brown book. To me, it's worth $1 million. I was able to remember 84 foods that sustained me emotionally during that time that I was lying on snow and ice. 84 foods. And some of them are obvious, some of them might not be. But if after we're through here, if you want to come up and look at this, fine. But you'll find all the foods clean, very, very neatly printed. I write left-handed, very, very sloppy. So I printed these out so anybody can read them very carefully. Now, the other end of that book, in the back of the book, has a list of over 20 illnesses, fevers, that I contracted during that period of captivity or later. And they're fascinating. And you might want to take a look at those too. But back again to the front. We were force marched. Most of the marches were at night. We were assigned to work on the railroads to rebuild their railroads that had been bombed. They needed them to transport goods and materials and ammunition to their troops. And we were forced to rebuild them. We sabotaged. One of the things that helps to soothe the bad memories of the war was the fact that we were able to sabotage just about everything that we did. Their inspection systems were badly flawed. We didn't link up the tracks as they should be. We didn't put the pins in where they should be. And so I dare say that no train could have traveled on those tracks. We wanted to share that. It was such a good feeling to be able to do something like that. But speech was not allowed. If we were caught talking one to another, we could be shot. Some were hit with rifle butts or the barrels who were caught talking. But we were well disciplined and we did it mostly through mouth movement, but tried to even conceal that, or just happy looks on our face that we had achieved something that day. One thing we could not avoid, though, was carrying those tracks, heavy metal tracks, sometimes from one town to another, mile after mile. Malnutrition had begun to set in. We were losing flesh. I know my bones were piercing, and yet I had to put a heavy railroad track on my shoulder. I had one end, somebody else had another end, and we went for miles at a time doing that. It's obvious that in these forced marches, many men dropped out along the way. I mean, illness and just exhaustion took hold. When any men dropped out, one of two things happened. On some occasions, they were just left by the side of the road just to die. In other cases, they were fired upon, shot, and killed. One thing I tried to avoid was getting to that state. Fortunately, I was probably in the best physical condition of my life. We had a very, very tough basic training at Fort McClellan, Alabama, and old-time cadre, military men, some of whom were involved in even World War I. But they were going to take this bunch of fresh young college kids, and they were really going to give it to us. What they did was to save my life and probably the lives of many others too. Now that went on and on. At one point, we were shot upon, fired upon, by our own Allied planes. Most of our marches were at night. Occasionally, they took us out during the day. From 10,000 feet in the air, rather difficult to distinguish the uniforms that were marching on the ground. They thought we were Germans. They fired on us. Some of our men were hit and killed. What hurt me even more, well, I shouldn't say even more, but almost equally, was the emotional part of that. At the end of their run, these Allied planes would make a big U-turn, and I knew they were going back. There were officers in those planes. And I knew they were going back to the officers' club. Great. They would have something nice and soft to sit on, warmth, a dinner, a drink, a cigar, and it was so terribly frustrating because we had nothing to look forward to. I didn't know if there would be any food the next day. And that went on and on. The tide of battle then started to turn. The Allied forces had regrouped, of course. They were driving the Germans back. They had to move us faster. They wanted to keep the prisoners that they had because we would be bargaining chips. There were many, many among their leadership that realized that the war was not going well for them. And some would again trade maybe some American lives for their own lives. They put us into a cattle car. I'm sure you have seen pictures, or some of you actually seen the cars that carried Jews and others to the concentration camps. There were no lights, no windows. Those cars were designed to hold 40 human beings. We were about 80. We were packed into those cars, body against body. There was no room to sit. Uncomfortable to say the least. When someone did slide down and sit, bodies tumbled over him. Once a day, the door opened on that cattle car, and they threw in some scraps of bread. Hunger was fierce. We hadn't eaten in days. And so we became pretty close to a pack of animals. We were so weak by that time that it was not possible for us to inflict damage on one another. But we did push and shove and crawl, and we crawled and clawed our way to those few scraps of bread. As they say, hunger was unbearable. And that went on. And we had no toilet facilities at all. You can imagine what the environment, the atmosphere in that cattle car was like. We stayed there for 6 days and nights. Some died. Some men went out of their minds. They became delirious. When that door was swung open, they pulled us out. We were again going on to a forced march. I only had one shoe at that time. I had earlier contracted frostbite, and my left foot would not fit in the shoe anymore. The pain was excruciating. I wanted to yell out, but I didn't dare. I would have gotten a rifle shot if I had. But I did get an opportunity, though, to throw away that shoe. The only winter garment I had left was a scarf, and I wrapped that around the foot. So when we were let out of the boxcar, I had one shoe and one scarf on the other foot. I wasn't about to go into a first march anymore. I always knew that I had two opportunities, as I've said before. One, the war will end, or two, maybe I can engineer an escape. And so I saw the way we were lined up as the troops. I saw where the guards were. And it appeared to me that if we encountered a curve, a certain kind of curve, the way the guards were positioned, we would be invisible for maybe 5 to 10 seconds. That did occur. I signaled to 2 other Americans. I had no other connection with them, but they were the nearest ones to me. I signaled to them, when I give you the signal, I'll give you a nod, throw yourselves over. We were either there were hedgerows or some kind of growth. I said, just throw yourselves over. We came to that, and I did give the signal. We threw ourselves over the hedge, and we lay there. My guess has always been that the troops behind us closed ranks. If they hadn't, then the guards certainly would have discovered there were openings there, and they would have come back and searched for us. So we lay there until they went by, and then we crawled back into a town that we had gone through on the train a little earlier, Reichenbach, a lovely, quaint little town. As we got closer to it, now I was crawling, well, sometimes on 2s and most of the time, though, on 4s. So 2s and 4s. The other 2 were able to walk. We crawled into this town. As we get close to the town, I hear sounds that I heard on the battlefield. And then we get closer, and I see they're tanks, German tanks. And then I see soldiers. And I realized we had escaped to a staging area for the Germans. If seen, we'd be shot. We crawled through back alleys. Somewhere in the distance, I saw a little white house. And again, instinct took over, and something told me it was a safe house. I said to the 2 others, that little white house over there, it's a safe house. We can be saved. They didn't know whether to believe me or not, but they went along with it. And we did cross through some back alleys. And we got to this house. An elderly couple lives there. A youngster, it must have been probably their grandson, the youngster comes in the door, right? And he looks, and he's about to close the door. I had one good foot, the left foot, and I used the old salesman's trick and put my foot in the door and held it long enough for voices to come from the rear. They sounded like elderly people. And I guess they were inquiring, who's there? At any rate, he signals for them to come forward. It's a little old man and a woman. He looks at my jacket and all of a sudden starts to smile. Now, we're in desperate shape, and this is not exactly a picnic we're on. And why would he be smiling? I learned in a little while why. He came out to the porch, looked up and down. There were no soldiers around. And he pulled us in. His wife went to the kitchen and got some hot soup with a piece of meat in it. It was delectable. I can't tell you. I savored it. Mostly you're inclined, when you're so very, very hungry, you're inclined to just gulp it down. No, I wanted to savor it because I didn't know what the taste of food was like after so many days of starvation. Why did he smile earlier? And why did they risk their lives to take us in? We were not far from Allied lines. We had gotten that close. We could hear heavy artillery. We could not hear small arms fire, rifle fire, yet. But we were pretty close. So they did take us in, and I learned from them. Why did they risk their lives? It appeared that some years earlier, they had gone to America. They had people, friends, or relatives, I don't remember which, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. They had nothing but admiration for America and Americans. And when he saw that U.S. emblem, that's what prompted them to risk their lives and help to save us. Now, they could not keep us there because if they were found with us, they'd be killed as traitors along with us. But they did draw a map and told us where we could hide out. They had a pretty good idea how close the American troops were, as we did just from the sounds. They told us where to hide out. It was a barn. We climbed into the barn. We were barely able to pull ourselves into the hayloft. And there we lie. must have been 2 or 3 days, and I'm lying in the hay. I'm looking out. Oh, maybe the size of a knothole, and I see something down an alleyway, and it looks like it was a helmet. Somebody marked by a helmet, and that helmet looked familiar. It wasn't a German helmet, and then I realized that's like my helmet. It's an American helmet. I mentioned it to the 2 other fellows, and you're hallucinating. No, I don't think so. And just as I said that, along comes a vehicle, and I could see, again, through this little hole, I see that vehicle go by. Ooh, it looked familiar. And then another one comes by, and I say, my gosh, that's an American Jeep, and I see the star on the hood. And sure enough, it was. And I said, they're here. We rolled down the hayloft and rolled down this alleyway. By that time, I was semi-delusional. But we crawled down, and there was the 3rd Armored Infantry Division of the same army we were in, the 3rd Armored Infantry. And they took us, virtually cradled us. I was, as I say, delirious. They talked. They asked questions. I couldn't respond. They did take me to a field hospital, though. And there they shaved off the bottom of my right foot. It was black. And had we not gotten there at that time, much later, I probably would have lost at least part of my leg. But they did some quick surgery. Those of you who have seen MASH, the TV show, it was a field hospital, very similar to that. And from there, they took me to the First General Hospital in Belgium, and then First General Hospital in Paris. I have no recollection of how I got to any of those places. I guess I was just semi-delirious. And so I wake up one day, and here I am in Paris. I had such a raging fever, they wouldn't let me get back to the States. Eventually, they forced the fever down, and I did get into a hospital plane, flew back to this country, landed at a little field in upstate New York, and was ushered to Halloran General Hospital on Staten Island. Anybody here remember Halloran General Hospital? Staten Island. That was the military hospital for the area here. And the care there was magnificent. I was critical at the time, so they put me in a private room. And I got stories from my parents later on. My father, when he went by to come to visit, he looked, the door was open, he looked at me, and he just went right on. He didn't recognize me. Facial characteristics had changed. The cheeks were obviously sunken, and I was just a bag of bones. So it didn't look like anybody he remembered. Other relatives came by, and they did the same thing. They just didn't recognize me. I've got a lot of great care there. I had a team of doctors, and they did wonders. And in time I was able to join others on the ward. Those diseases that I mentioned, I have in my little brown book here. How did I know what they were? And there's some very, very strange names here. Many different fevers, etc. Each day the nurse would tell me what the doctor wrote on the chart. And some days, another new one, yeah, another new ailment that you got. Another fever you must have picked up along the way. At any rate, eventually, as I say, I did get back onto the floor. It took me a while to make acquaintanceships with the others around me. I hadn't talked for so long. But eventually I did. When I became well enough, along with the others, I was up and dressed in a brilliant maroon bathrobe. This was in America. Some of you, I'm looking around here, some of you know what America was like at that time. You know, Tom Brokaw called it the greatest generation, and it clearly was. even though I see some shaking heads, it was. The American people, of course, couldn't do enough for the military. They couldn't do enough during the wartime. You remember that the war was partially financed by the American people. They bought war bonds. And all wanted to volunteer in some way. I remember one incident, too. I'm out on the battlefield. We're being shelled. Just before that battle, they had brought mail. Mail went through, and wherever we stopped, we got mail. And I'm on this battlefield, and I read a letter from my mother, and she says, "Papa is out patrolling the neighborhood." The neighborhood? You're in South Orange, New Jersey. What do you mean, patrolling the neighborhood? He was an air raid warden. And she said, he's wearing his helmet. Wow. And, you know, I thought it was so wild. At that time, I'm getting bombed here. And she's talking about his patrolling South Orange, New Jersey. It wasn't as wild as it seems, because we did have. Of course, it was part of Hitler's plan, and it was going to be world conquest. And as I learned from some of the soldiers that I talked to, that was their next aim. Britain would go under. Lend-Lease, the American Lend-Lease program, helped sustain them a little longer. And eventually, of course, Roosevelt rallied the Americans to believe that it was really our war. And everybody wanted to get behind it. But after that continued to after the war. They would dress us in these beautiful maroon bathrobes, and it would take us to Madison Square Garden, Yankee Stadium, theater in New York, wherever we went. Before the event, I remember there was an announcement made, and our boys are here. I don't remember if they said boys and girls or whatever, but and very often they said our heroes are here, because every American who came back was a hero. And the audience would clap and cheer and roar before every event. It was just a great, great time to be an American, and probably helped to condition me. Now, do any of you remember in the Catskills, the famous Jewish resort?
Grossinger's.
Who? Grossinger's. Grossinger's. Mrs. Grossinger had a deal with Halloran General Hospital that she would take soldiers that the chaplain advised to be taken, chaplain and the doctors. So Jenny Grossinger had that open invitation. They cured most of my ailments, but they couldn't put any weight on me. And so the chaplain says to the doctors, you know, we're not putting any weight on this man. He's got to gain. Why don't we send him to Grossinger's? And that's what they did. And I'll tell you, 1 week there, I gained so much weight. I came back, and the chaplain says, you see what I said? You know what I meant? See? Jenny did more than all you doctors, all your pills and all your doctoring and everything else. He's going back for another week. So I got a second week there.
How much had you lost? How much weight?
Oh, I went in weighing 155. When I came back, I was 89 pounds. So obviously there was a lot to be gained. And she put on quite a few pounds, I'm sure, with those 2 weeks that I spent there. But that's what it was like. A family had a box seat at Carnegie Hall, and I was a student of music at the time. So they turned that box, front box, right overlooking the orchestra. It was magnificent. They gave that up, and I and others of the group would spend our Thursday nights there at Carnegie Hall. So much of that went on. I was on radio shows, and one of the strangest things that happened, which really directed the rest of my life, and that was I was interviewed by Stan Lomax. The name may mean something to some of you. Stan Lomax was a sports announcer, but then he was one of the outstanding broadcasters at the time. He introduced me because I was considered an atrocity case, a German atrocity case, which was more than just having been a prisoner of war. And so he did interview me, and that broadcast, for some strange reason, was picked up in Athens, Ohio. And that's where I had gone to school before the war. And for some reason, it's a Saturday afternoon, in the Hillel Foundation. Do any of you know, when I talk about the Hillel Foundation, some of you know what that is. It is a Jewish organization that does interreligious work on campuses and gives Jewish kids an opportunity to live a Jewish life. And so they were having, somebody had a radio on, and they heard it. When I came back after the war, now I had gone through the hospitalization, I was reoriented again to civilian life, and I went back to complete my schooling. When I got back on campus, because they had heard the name mentioned in that broadcast, Hillel was having its annual meeting. They elected me president. None of them had ever met me. But this is, again, what American people were like. Here's he's come through a hell, and he's come back here now to make him president. And so I was elected president. But I approached the woman who had run through the war years. The men had taken off for war. Who ran a good part of our country and our nation? And who ran Hillel Foundation? The women. And there's Shirley. Her name is Shirley Biller. And she had been running it, and she should have become president. But because, again, they regarded the military. I'm now president of a foundation I know nothing about, of an organization I know nothing about. And I say to Shirley, would you work with me? Would you be my editor? And she says, yes. And that is the beginning, was the beginning of more than 60 years of a partnership. Well, 67 years of a partnership. Shirley passed away this last July. And it broke up this partnership of 67 years. And it was genuinely a partnership. I had been very, very active in the Jewish community, led a lot of organizations. And it was a transition that took place those months that I lie awake in the hospital. You have a lot of time to think. And something was going on. And there was a transition that actually took place within me. And it said that really, you survived. And there must be a reason for it. And that reason turned out to be that, yes, I was to devote the rest of my life, not just to business, but also to helping others. And so that's what I did. And all during that time, while we worked on community affairs, on building organizations and different concepts and ideas that helped other people. It was Shirley who worked with me. So we became a partnership for those 67 years. I think I mentioned before, for 53 years I did not want to talk about the war. And it was only, again, the meeting with Elie Wiesel and the urging of my 7 years and 9-year-old grandchildren that got me to talk about it. And I did about 15 years ago, linked up with our Holocaust Council. Holocaust education, as I think many of you know, is mandated in the state of New Jersey. And why? For a very, very good reason. Because as Elie Wiesel always said and echoed time and again, to never, never forget. We have to make sure, though, that it's perpetuated, that future generations will know and will remember. It's so easy to forget. Many will forget the war. Many will forget the Holocaust. But it must remain forever known by all, so that when the opportunity again exists for someone to come along, like an Adolf Hitler, there will be enough awareness among the population to take steps to help keep it from operating. So that became part of my destiny, to make sure that I started to talk. And I, along with many others, we have a number of Holocaust survivors. And that's what we do. We go out to the schools. I've talked to thousands and thousands of young people. And that's the message. The responses I get are so sometimes overwhelming. I have piles and piles of letters that come back from these young people, because I tell them 50 and 60 years from now, people are going to forget. It can happen again. We're the last of the generation that lived through it. We're the eyewitnesses. But you now have the benefit of hearing from eyewitnesses what happened there. So you will be the witnesses in that generation to make sure the world will never, ever forget. And that has been my mission for these most recent years. And I hope, I'll be 93 in July, and I hope I got a few more years to continue talking, because it's the greatest joy of ever talking about such horrible, horrible conditions, but knowing that they're going to very sensitive ears, and that many of these kids are going to remember, and they're going to be able to speak for the future, which we could not do earlier. We hadn't had the experience. So with that, are there any questions? Yes. Oh, wait. Would somebody come up and moderate? I need somebody to moderate. My hearing is not all that it should be, and
Speak loudly.
The sergeant, the German sergeant that captured you,
German sergeant.
whatever happened to him? Did you ever find out?
there are three people really that I wanted to see after the war. One was him. I would have no idea where in the world I could ever find him. We never exchanged names, so I couldn't possibly. And yet that sequence between me and that sergeant is something that I think many, many people would like to hear, because there's a transition that goes on in our relationship and in the conversation. We go from mortal enemies to comrades. Strangest thing. He recognizes valor. He said, you guys fought during the war. We were 6 of us, and they were somewhere between 100 and 150 with foxholes to protect themselves. And yet we managed to survive. And he recognized that valor. But to hear that conversation, and one of the things that I've been working on, I have written the whole story, the whole story of this experience, pre and then post, what happened as a result of that. Just finishing the book now. In fact, last July, I was interviewed, a full-day interview by the by the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. They spent an entire day interviewing me, because it's a unique story. Part of that uniqueness, of course, that little incident, and that was the relationship between a German sergeant and an American soldier. So that interview is now in the museum, and it's also available. If any of you want to look at it, it runs for 4.5 hours. So I don't think, but it is on the internet too. It's posted there, and we're trying to get it reduced to 27 minutes, just taking out some of the highlights. But that incident, recorded, if it were done live on film, is very, very interesting, because you see the change. I'm sure the changes in facial expression, and the changes in attitude, and between him, and that's why, for some reason, that's going on, and that's what saved my life. But I never did get back, and I wanted to get back particularly to that German family, because them I could possibly find if I got back to that town. I never did do it. The closest I got was to get back to Omaha Beach and to be able to look down at the sands and people swimming in places where we emerged from our ships, the LSTs, onto the shores. And now I see people swimming down there. Strange reaction to see people living a normal life. And in the distance, if any of you have been there, and I'm sure some of you have been to Omaha Beach, and you see still those ships that were sunk and the metal still protruding from the water and all that. They maintain that, and I suspect that they will do it for a long time.
Can you clarify on why you wouldn't call it a slave labor camp?
Oh, yes. Yeah, one problem that I have, I've been interviewed many times by publications and on each of the major TV stations. And invariably, the interviewer will always refer to the fact that I was in a slave labor camp. And it always bothers me when they refer to camp, because a camp meant that you had housing, you have shelter, you have a bed, you have warmth, you have food. I had absolutely none of those. All of the time that I was a prisoner, I spent it all out of doors. The temperature during that period of time ranged between 0 and 5 degrees Fahrenheit. And as I say, the roads were covered with ice and snow. That's where I slept, that's where I lived, with very flimsy garments. How I lived, I'm not certain. Many died just from exposure alone, or from starvation, or from malnutrition. And I would tell you, the emotional part of living through that was in many respects worse than the physical. Part of the time, when I lie awake at night, there were times that I thought, if this starvation goes on, I'm going to die, no question about it. I can only go on so long without food. And I came close to doing that. Yes.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. You're right. You're right.
Very short. Did that German sergeant allow any of the other men you were captured with to be returned with you to the behind their lines?
He sent me off with 2 guards.
Okay.
So I have no idea what happened. But I will tell you one other little piece about how that relationship was developing. At one point, he reached down to his pocket. That was another time that he might be going for a pistol. He pulls out his wallet. Here are 2 guys who are pledged to kill one another. He pulls out a wallet and he opens it, and he showed me a picture of his family. It was him, his wife, 2 children, a boy and a girl. I wasn't much older, and I always thought maybe his son was in his probably probably in his mid-teens. And I always thought that was one of the reasons, perhaps, that he wanted to save my life, because I was not much older than his own son. But he held that picture up to show me. He said, next year, we will be in New York City. And he had no question, no doubts about the fact that they would be. That was part of Hitler's plan. And the U.S., after Britain would fall, the U.S. was next. Yes.
All the way in the back?
You already answered some of my questions. I was wondering about the Germans who saw the German Nazi soldiers. Did you find in your interaction with other German soldiers that they were decent human beings, maybe forced into war just like we were? Or do you think maybe some of them started out decently and then they turned into killing machines? Or did you have
There were many Germans who, of course, were not Nazis. There were some who were sympathizers. On occasion, in these forced marches, they would march us through towns, mostly small towns. And as they did, remember, we're trophies now. They captured us. There were people lined up along the sidewalks. I saw no reaction that I could say was Nazi-oriented. I saw people, sometimes with frowns on their face. I saw some people, mostly they were elderly women. I saw some with tears in their eyes. They were not certainly sympathetic to what the Nazis were doing to their victims and all that. But I didn't hear any cheering. I didn't hear anything. I saw solemnity on the looks of these faces. And this was not a victory march for the Germans. No, we were victims, and many, many sympathized with us, really. Yes.
After you graduated from college, what did you do in subsequent years?
Well, I got a job with a food chain. I went to work, and at a certain point, I had been the last employment I had was with NBC, and I was a vice president of a subsidiary of NBC. And then, before I went my own way, I was a marketing vice president for an electrical equipment service company. I had huge success, for some reason, with writing letters. This is 1969. It was easy to get to presidents of major corporations. They were not conglomerates yet, so many of them. And so you could write directly to the president of a company and get an audience. And so I did write to presidents, and the effect was very good, so good. This engineering company increased a lot of its business tremendously during that period because we got access to the plants and so forth of these big companies. And so with that kind of success, people start to suggest, hey, why don't you become a consultant and teach other people to write like that? And you hear it enough. You say, hey, maybe it's time. And so I did, and I started my own company. And we built training organizations to train people in major corporations here and overseas in communication skills, mostly writing, different forms of writing and so forth, and ended up hiring a staff. A large staff, we had hired 30 people to do all the evaluations, but essentially we became a communications-oriented company. When the computer became more common, we built programs, we worked on the computer. And that's part of the experience that I referred to with my wife, a 67-year partnership, because she was in the business too. And she ran everything really needed internally. She took over and really ran it so effectively. So I could be outside doing seminars and getting new customers.
Did the German troops make any distinction about Jewish?
Anything about Jewish?
Being Jewish?
Did the German
Right.
soldiers distinguish?
Yes. The Germans that I associated with had only one interest. They were required to get us to work. No ideology, nothing like that among them. Nobody asked. I wore my dog tags in the combat. Mind you, I was 20 years old at the time. And really, yeah, like a guy 20 years old would be. Nobody, and I had no reason at all to hide my Jewishness. I would have even done that. Would it have been wise? Not so sure. But nevertheless, I decided I was not going to do that. Had I been captured and made a prisoner of war, I probably would have been interrogated and probably would have been asked to open my shirt and show them my dog tags. So I wore the dog tags all through. These are the original ones. And the dog tag had a J, mine had a J. Some had an H for Hebrew, some had a J. But in addition to the dog tags, I had on here, it's a miniature Star of David, and most any German, I think, would understand. And if they didn't, they would see also a miniature mezuzah. Anybody know what a mezuzah is? You know, and we Jews mount them on the doorposts of our homes, so forth. So these were two symbols that would be very clear to them. And I had no reservation at all in wearing them constantly. And had I been discovered Jewish, I might have been I might have either been killed or sent to the Burga, I shouldn't say concentration, the Berger prisoner of war camp to a place where this was a camp. Many Jews were sent there. Many died there. The treatment was harsh. The only difference between them and what I went through was they did have a barracks, they did have some warmth, they did have food. But again, they were treated harshly, and that's where I probably would have ended up, if not shot. Yes?
Were the Americans treated any differently than the Soviets or British?
When you say treated,
I mean,
They
everyone
really-
had to work.
yeah, I think it was probably indistinguishable. I could see no difference. Remember, at this point, the guards who were responsible for us had no sense of who we were, where we were from, what countries, what our political views were, none whatsoever. If you were a human being, as long as you could, and wherever you came from, but as long as you could work, that's all that they were interested in. So I don't recall, I didn't see any distinction between the Soviet Union soldiers and our own. We were all, the treatment was so harsh. The beatings were not uncommon. The shootings were not uncommon. I saw so many shot and killed. And some were Russians, some were Americans, some were British.
What were the transgressions for which they were shot?
Unwillingness or inability to work. When I was in the hospital, somebody from Washington was doing some interviewing, building cases, and I was questioned in the hospital. Why? Because I saw and had reported earlier that a German sergeant, whose name happened to be Eisenhower, very easy to remember, it was spelled H-A-U-E-R instead of O-W. And I saw him take out a pistol and fire it at one of our soldiers who could not get up. He was just too weak to rise. And this sergeant, German sergeant, as they say, just shot him. So I did testify against him. And I did see some of that, and others when they dropped out along the way. I did see some of them shot. Yes, they weren't trying to conceal anything. As far as they were concerned, we were just fodder. And probably most of us, they believe, probably most of us, would become extinct some way, either by being killed or by starving to death, or one way or another. They may have thought that way.
Other than a few crumbs of bread, were you given anything more substantive to eat on a daily basis?
We passed through two labor camps. We just passed through, just less than a day at each. In one of them, Prum, P-R-U-M, Germany, we were given 6 1-inch in diameter crackers. That was it for the day. 6 tiny crackers, nothing on the crackers. And then from there we went through another town called Gerolstein. And there, a little variety. We got cans, old metal cans, like a Campbell soup can. And in it was some hot water. And they threw in maybe a little piece of potato, which didn't give it much flavor. But that was it. So a little liquid, that was it for the whole day. And that only happened 2 days, one in each place. Yes?
I was stationed in Prum from 1959 to 1963.
In Prum?
In Prum, Germany. Reichsprum, near Bitburg. We had a secret. By then, when I was there, we had a secret radar base, the 615th Aircraft Control and Warning Squadron. I'm a doctor, and I was the hospital commander. We had a little 30-bed hospital, which took in people that we take care of for minor things, but we take them down to the hospital in Bitburg. At that time, there was no camp or anything like that. The only thing that was unique about Bitburg, it was an old Catholic town with a great cathedral. And the machinations of the holidays were almost medieval, with the chanting, going down the roads at night with lanterns. It was a unique experience for me to be there. I hired, we were short of people, so I hired 2 German doctors to help me at the hospital. I had 2 dentists, 2 American doctors, and 2 German doctors. The other thing I can say about it is, I never met a German, except one, who fought on the American front. They always said to me, they fought the Russians. Until I went to a cocktail party, I'll never forget it, it was in Holland, a fancy cocktail party in Hilversum. I met a German pilot who had been a Luftwaffe pilot, and he was telling me about his experiences, how wonderful it was to fly for Germany on the American front. I shook his hand and I thanked him. I speak German, so I was able to thank him for being so honest. So that was a unique experience. I'm Jewish. It was a unique experience for me to live in Germany for 4 years, from 59 to 63, between my surgical residency and my orthopedic residency. So that was a hell of a good time, I'll tell you, and an eye-opener for me.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Interesting, interesting.
Well,
Germans...
the good thing about Prum, by the way, is it's in the Moselle Valley.
Yeah.
1959 was the best wine year of the century. And you could smell in the valley the grapes. And so you had this wonderful Moselle wine, or else it was right near the Rhine River, you had Rhine wine too. It's a great white wine, super.
Oh dear. I wish I had known it then. In Germany, I would have asked for something better than that hot soup, supposedly.
15 years makes a difference.
Any others?
Good health to you.
Huh?
Good health to you.
Thank you.
The WWII Book Club, I'd like to thank you all for coming. And if we don't have your email address, there was a sign-up sheet. Please do so, because I can let you know we start up again in September. So if you're interested in more sessions like this, please join our club. Thank you. This is quite a...